atheism dead? If not, it certainly seems to be on life support. Let's talk about it with Eric Metaxas on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And I am Steve, the aforementioned old white guy, and I say it a lot, but I mean it. We're glad you're here. You always have a place at our table. Our executive producer, Matthew Porter, is here. Matthew wonders how on a website cookies enhance performance, but in his diet, not so very much. Our producer Jinx is in his little glass booth. Like a certain cable news channel, his audio mix is fair and balanced.
That's right.
I believe I said that. Our video director and IT guy, John, have you tried turning it off and on again? Myers is in his tech bunker. And Dr. George Bingham is the president of Key Life. George believes dead atheists like Christopher Hitchens should more accurately be called former atheists. Kathy, who everybody knows is the soft feminine side of the program and who everybody knows runs things around Key Life. So if something goes wrong, take it up with Kathy. You agree with that?
No
He
time.
has given up on Matt's.
No time to disagree. We have an important guest today. Let's go.
And he is important. Eric Metaxas is our friend, and he's been on a number of times, and we're glad to have him again. He's in California, and he had to get up really early to do this. And as an early riser, I recognize his spirituality and his depth, early to bed and early to rise. Well, you know, Eric is the #1 New York Times bestselling author. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I didn't see it. I canceled my subscription. And the New Yorker, ditto. He also hosts the Eric Metaxas radio show, a daily syndicated show, and is a senior fellow and lecturer at large at the King's College in Manhattan. And his latest book, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is titled, Is Atheism Dead? Eric, thanks for being with us at this.
Thanks for inviting me at this ungodly hour. I hate you, but I'm a professional. So I'm going to move forward with this. I'm staring at the Pacific Ocean, which I don't like as oceans go. I prefer the Atlantic, but I seriously, I'm thrilled to talk to you about what I consider an extremely important subject. And that subject is, how can you get copies of my book? No, I was kidding. I want to present myself. You're talking about Kathy. I think of myself today as the feminine side of the program. I smell pretty, and I'm ready to talk to you about anything, Steve, whatever you like.
And his hair is still wet from the shower.
My hair is drying. It's a fascinating concept.
Drying. Sorry.
How's your baking?
This is, by the way, this is a great book. It's an apologetic book. And if you have some doubts, this is your book. If you have atheist friends, this is your book. If you want to say things that make a difference, that are balanced and rational about science and philosophy, this is your book. But Eric, the subject of the book has important implications. and scary implications as we move away from the old gods and the old ways and the old thoughts. Some really bad things have started happening.
Yes.
You want to address that at the beginning, and then we'll get into.
When you say really bad things, are you talking about Biden's hacking cough? What are you referring to?
I'm talking about the loss of freedom.
He coughed up a lung on the tarmac yesterday.
Culture. I'm talking about self-righteousness and anger and hatred, and the way we cut out anybody who disagrees in a country.
Well, this is all logical
standards that make that possible.
Well, the book, first of all, I should say the reason the book is titled "Is Atheism Dead?" is because in 1966, Time magazine put the secular narrative in front of the American people in every American living room, where it stayed basically for the last 50-something years. And they asked the question, is God dead? Even to ask that question in 1966 was shocking, more than just shocking, a little offensive. What did it mean? We as a nation stood against godless communism, and that just wasn't some, trope. The idea is that we knew as a nation that as screwed up as we are, we wanted to follow God. We wanted to believe in justice and freedom for all, and all these things. These were not ideas that didn't mean anything. They meant everything. And so when we talked about communism and we said godless communism, we knew that in places where they would torture and kill you for not towing the party line, they could do that because they didn't believe God existed, or they said they didn't believe he existed. So there were no standards except the standards imposed by people with power. When you take God out of the equation, that's what happens. Now, the geniuses who came up with the American system, and when I say geniuses, I mean, this is no understatement. They figured out a way to allow for atheists, Buddhists, Jews, Christians of every stripe, Muslims. They figured out a way that we could have freedom of religion because they believed, as anybody who believes in the free market of ideas, that generally speaking, the good ideas will rise to the top. So we're not going to force anything. And if we do force religion, we will screw it up. The reason many people came to our shores from Europe was because religion was forced on them. And when you force religion, it sort of ceases to be real. It becomes part of the party of the power of the state. So it's a long way of saying that the founders understood that at the heart of American liberty is this idea of freedom of religion, that religion is vital, but it can't be forced. So they let people do whatever they wanted, hoping that it would work. It ended up working magnificently. In 1826, when Tocqueville came over here from France, he said, what is going on? Like, the churches seem to encourage liberty, and liberty comes out of the churches. This is something in France. It was exactly the opposite because religion was coerced in France. So it was seen as this powerful thing that was allied with the monarchy, which was oppressive. But only in America did we have this beautiful idea of freedom of religion that led to faith, which led to freedom. Beautiful, beautiful idea. Well, that's worked for close to 250 years. But as you all know, in the last 50 years, it's been on the wane, and secular ideas have crept in that I always mark with that magazine article, Is God Dead? And so ultimately, the reason I wrote the book with the title Is Atheism Dead? Is because in the last 50 or so years, ironically, evidence has mounted up, principally from science, that is so astonishingly pointing to God that, first of all, nobody knows this stuff. Nobody's heard of this stuff. So when I stumbled on it, I thought, this is crazy. This is true. We should at least get the message out there. And then I bumped into stuff from biblical archaeology, more astonishing stuff. It was also astonishing. I thought, I've got to put this in a book because most Christians don't know about this. This is earth-shaking stuff. And so the title of the book is Atheism Dead? Because my principal thesis is that if you look at the facts, and you're not obliged to, but if you do, you will discover that the concept that there is no God is no longer intellectually tenable. If you want to be an agnostic, great. We can talk. We all have questions. But the idea that I could say, I know there's no God, that the world came into being via random natural processes, that is now effectively proven to be baloney, and you can forget about it. And if you don't believe it, read the book.
Good stuff. And the book does deal in your face with those particular issues. Eric, I think you're naive if you think people think rationally. They'll read your book, change, and we'll all join hands and walk off singing Kumbaya. That's not going to happen.
I don't think that's going to happen, but I think that there are people who are honest, who are really looking for answers. Those are the kind of people I'm aiming at. And I know that they exist. And you're right. You can't prove people into the kingdom, but there are plenty of people out there with real answers, and they haven't been getting them. So that's why I wrote the book.
It's a great book, and you guys need to check on it. It's called Is Atheism Dead? And if you're a believer, you never thought it was alive. Hey, guys, we're going to back out, rest up. This is really hard work. And then, like Jesus, we're going to return. We're so glad you're here, and we're talking with Eric Metaxas, and his latest book is called Is Atheism Dead? And if sometimes you would like your faith bolstered or your arguments, your polemics more profound, this is your book. A great study for a small group in your church. And it's simply, there's no subtitle, Is Atheism Dead? And that's how we know it's serious and sober, because it doesn't have a subtitle.
Eric, before I ask my question, I just want to tell you, when I've read your books in the past, especially like Bonhoeffer and Luther and that kind of thing, you expect with historical biographies, you obviously expect a lot of detail leading into whatever the subject matter is in a particular chapter, et cetera. The thing that I love about this, and which is a stupid way to read a book, I acknowledge that, but I went down through the table. I do this frequently. Went down through the table of contents and opened it up and looked at it, and I went straight for the chapter that zeroes in on the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I loved the way you didn't just say, okay, here's this kid and he's climbing around and he finds these and they're like, this is like a miraculous find and this has changed the course of, et cetera. You went back so far and traced all of that information all the way up to that, and then carried it on through. And I read it twice because, I knew about that particular fact, but I didn't know about any of that other stuff. And I think one of the things that you do so well is you weave all this information so that people can maybe perhaps for the first time be able to see the legitimacy of what it is that the information that you're trying to present without just saying, okay, this is a fact. Now we'll go on to something else. Anyway,
I actually think that that's very important. And it's not like I set out to do that. I do it instinctively because I feel like you want people to understand how almost unbelievably fascinating this is. If they don't understand that, they're not going to care. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is, a lot of the stuff in this book, I'm not just making it up. I'm not just saying this to sell books. It is astonishing. If you're not blown away, you didn't get it. There are things out there that, the idea that those scrolls were preserved makes almost no sense. Nothing should be preserved that long. And you have to explain that in the book, because I want people to understand how freaky this is. It's one thing for a kid to discover them. That's a super freaky thing all by itself. Then the fact that they existed there through the centuries in a place that you literally couldn't make a place better to preserve things than that place. I mean, it goes on and on. And I think when people get these details, part of it is to have awe at what God has done, to really understand, like, whoa, this is freaky stuff. I never really knew this before. And again, that's a relatively mild story, but I appreciate that you appreciate that, because that's something that I feel, when I want to write about archaeology stuff, and let me be clear, the book is about science, then there's archaeology, and then there's just stuff about atheism and history. But I didn't know what I was going to do initially. And you discover some of these archaeological stories, and I just wanted to list them. I just wanted to mention them. And as you get into it, you're thinking, I can't just mention this. I've got to give the background. Otherwise, it's a dud. It's like giving the punchline without telling the joke. You've got to explain why this is amazing, because I actually believe that I want this book to get believers in particular super excited about what we know. This is what we know. This is not what we believe. This is knowledge. This is history, science, whatever. And it bolsters our faith. In fact, I think it bolsters our faith tremendously. But a lot of times we act like, well, that doesn't matter. It does matter. And some of these things that God has done are just so crazy. If you don't know the details, you just shrug. And we've had enough shrugging.
I think
Dead Sea Scrolls, excuse me.
I was just going to say, I think fascinating, and awe and all of that, I think are absolutely great words to describe that, because it's just so important to the story and tracing the history of the whole thing. Anyway, that said, the question I wanted to ask you was, in the very beginning of the book, you talk about an interesting story about Einstein. So let's kind of wet people's whistle to want to pick up the book. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the story of Einstein, in a funny way, is the thesis for the whole book. And what is that thesis? The thesis is that about 1859, when Darwin came out with Origin of the Species, this idea was set into the world that we could have everything without God. We could have this beautiful world. I mean, I'm sitting here literally looking at the Pacific Ocean. And if you're logical, the idea that all this just happened is lunacy on a level that's inexpressible, like the world as it is, like we just happen to be here. But in 1859, Darwin writes Origin of the Species, and he sets this idea in the world that everything happened naturalistically. We don't need God. You start with life, and it just magically evolves into giraffes and frogs and fish and people and every kind of plant, and that's just what happened all by itself, right? So that starts this idea in the world of science and scientists, mainly, not in the mainstream population, but that there's a division between science and faith. Now, that's a lie from the pit of hell, but they bought it. And this crept through the intellectual circles in the latter part of the 19th century, so that by the time you get to Einstein, and this is to me the irony and the hilarity of the story, you'd think, who could be less secure on planet Earth as a scientist than Albert Einstein? Nobody's going to push him around. He doesn't care what people think. He's Einstein, right? Well, he's a human being. And in 1911, before he was really famous, he was doing his equations, and he comes up with the idea from his equations that, the universe is expanding. Now, it's funny for us to think that in 1911, which is now 110 years ago, Einstein, when he notices this, he's troubled. Why? Because the genius Einstein says, if the universe is expanding, as my equations surely show it is, that means it expanded from someplace. It expanded from a point, which means at one point it didn't exist, which means it once didn't exist and it once was created. And that sounds a lot like the biblical narrative. I'm a scientist. I can't do anything that sounds like the Bible or religion. So he was so frightened by this that he buries it with this thing called the cosmological constant, this fudge factor. Einstein has already bought the lie that science is at odds with faith. And about 20 years later, he says, that was the greatest blunder of my whole life. I was wrong. Yes, the universe is expanding. It's not my fault that it sounds like scripture. It's what the facts from science bear out. That's the short version of it.
Wow.
Oh, great story. And there's more. And that's why you don't want to go anyplace, because we're going to talk about more. If anybody asks you, you tell them you're listening to Steve Brown, etc. Hey, we're hanging out with Eric Metaxas. You can find more from Eric at ericmetaxas.com. And you can follow him on Twitter at Eric Metaxas. During the break, we were talking more about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at the time, I was a student at Boston University and a wacko liberal. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, not only, they predated every manuscript that we had by over 1,000 years. It not only, as you point out, Eric, dealt with the silliness of atheism, it also dealt with the silliness of a lot of very wacko theological and biblical stuff. And in fact, was a part of the reason that I joined the enemy. That would be you guys. Eric, you might want to comment on that some more.
Well, the fact of the matter is, let's cut to the chase here. American Christians often have bought into a bad theology. And in case you wonder where bad theology comes from, it comes from the pit of hell, from Satan's mouth. So bad theology is the idea that, well, we should be nice all the time. We shouldn't fight. Here's the issue. We are in a life and death battle for souls. And the truth is on the side of the scripture. And we sometimes act like, well, everybody's got a point. Well, everybody may have a point, but everyone can also go to hell. And the fact of the matter is, we need to talk about what is right and true. And every time you turn around, and there's a lot of this in the book, it's why I wrote it, you find archaeology and science corroborating the scripture in a way that is deeply embarrassing to people who have an atheistic or a theologically liberal worldview. When you talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and you calmly say they predated the previous manuscripts by 1,000 years, 1,000, ladies and gentlemen, did you hear that? 1,000 years. And that doesn't even tell you how dramatic it was. This blew people's minds. This was deeply embarrassing because there are people that said like, oh, half of everything was written in 500 AD and made up and this and that. And here you have proof that is so dramatic, so overwhelming that it just spun people's heads around. And what I write about in the book is that this happens over and over and over, and people tend not to report on it or they bury it. They basically buried the Dead Sea Scrolls. These scholars sat on it like the dog in the manger and didn't let anybody look at what they found for like 50 years because it's embarrassing. And they say, well, we need time to look at it and to examine it, this and that. Well, I'll cut to the chase. The Dead Sea Scrolls were planted there like an Easter egg by God to blow people's minds. And he chose the time of their discovery, 1947. It's an insane story how they were discovered. They could still be there and never be discovered. And there are a number of archaeological discoveries just like that when you encounter it, you think, how did this happen? How did we just happen to find it now? Part of the reason I wrote the book is I found something from the world of science and something from the world of archaeology, both of which it was like random meetings of two people. I met a guy in Albuquerque. That sounds like a Johnny Cash song, doesn't it? I met a man in Albuquerque.
Did you shoot him?
Actually, you probably know, Skip Heitzig introduced me to this archaeology. He said, this guy discovered biblical Sodom. I said, what? Biblical Sodom was destroyed 1700 BC. That's the first couple of pages of the Bible. That's like mythic territory. Right? And I looked into it and I thought, this is like open and shut. This is not like he thinks he discovered Sodom. There was a gigantic article in Nature magazine, which when Nature is the premier scientific journal in the world, or one of them. 21 scientists corroborate this and so on and so forth. And this is real. So when I heard about this, I'm always initially blown away. And then I'm blown away and angry by the fact that no one knows about this. I said, this is monumental information. The world needs to know. Bumped into a bunch of things like that on the scientific side. And I said, most educated Christians I know don't know this. And this is science. This is not Christian philosophy or theology. The world needs to know. So there's a lot of science in the book and a lot of archaeology in the book that I would argue makes it so difficult to discount the Bible that there are going to be people, they just don't want to know what's in this book. And so my goal is to get this in the hands of every believer so that at least you are armed with as solid faith as you could possibly have to know that what you believe, there's nothing you need to apologize for. It happens to be true as 1 + 2, as true as the periodic table. This stuff is real. And if believers don't know that, we're going to be timid about how we present our faith. We are no longer in a place where we can be timid. We need to be on the march, praying as prayer warriors, being active in our communities because we're going through a tough time. We need this information now. And I just believe the Lord gave it to me to write for such a time as this, to quote my favorite book.
The name of the book is Atheism Dead? And most Christians are quite timid because we think that the atheists are so smart and have the facts on their side. That's why you need to read this book. You're going to be surprised at how shallow and superficial and blind and mean unbelievers can be to you. So it has a selfish motive too. We'll talk more about it when we come back. Come back with us. Hey, we're so glad that you're a part of this. We love Eric Metaxas. He, by the way, is getting older and forgets things. So what he's decided to do is to put everything that goes through his mind, every place he goes, every book and article he writes down on his website. And you got to go there and you got to subscribe to the newsletter. It's Eric Metaxas. By the way, Metaxas is METAXAS. EricMetaxas.com. Subscribe to the newsletter, and every person who subscribes gets 3 free sins.
And you don't have to hunt for it. It's right there on the homepage. I just did it during the break.
EricMetaxas.com. I honestly, I'm no longer shy about begging people. Please, folks, you don't know. You'll see. Go to EricMetaxas.com, sign up for the newsletter. And if you can't sign up, email us and we'll sign up for you. But I tell you, I'm interviewing some people. It is so fascinating. I hate the idea that YouTube canceled me. So I want to get this information to you. Please help yourself by helping me help you. EricMetaxas.com. Now, you were just saying, Steve, and I want to forget about this. The first part of the book is about science, which honestly, I promise you, people will be astonished. And when I say astonished, there's no exaggeration. There are things that science has discovered. Imagine, science has discovered, this is the irony. Science has discovered things that point to God so dramatically that pretty much when you discover it, you're almost not going to believe it. You're going to say, I bought into this narrative that science is at odds with faith somehow, which is garbage. It's another lie from the pit of hell. It's not only not true, it's the opposite of the truth. John Lennox says that, in fact, logically, atheism is incompatible with science. Think about that. So I write about that. But at the end of the book, the first part of the book is science, and buckle your seatbelts for some of that stuff. Then there's archaeology, which is a lot of fun stories. But the third part of the book, I deal with atheism itself. And the biggest shock to me was realizing that the new atheists, Hitchens, Dawkins, and company, I thought they're so smart, they must have a lot to say. And as I looked into it, I just thought they are 104% smoke. They are vicious, untruthful. I mean, they may be nice people, but when it comes to this stuff, they effectively don't have an intellectual leg to stand on. And so they keep switching topics, to fool people and cracking jokes but ultimately they have almost nothing to say. Here's the biggest lie, just so people understand. They said it over and over like a marketing slogan, and it worked. They said that we stand for reason, and reason is against faith. We stand for science, and science is against faith and religion. That is garbage. Number one, they didn't stand for reason or logic, not by a long. It's like saying, I stand for math, but you never do any math because you don't know anything about math, but you stand for math. They say that science is at odds with faith over and over and over. And the irony is that not only does faith point to God, not only does science point to God, but if it weren't for Christian faith, listen to this one. If it weren't for the Christian faith, we wouldn't even have modern science. That's not an exaggeration. Modern science and the scientific revolution that gave us everything we have came from Christian faith. And in the book, I quote non-Christians who make this case very clearly from history. This is not some Christian idea. It is a fact. It's also a fact that all of the men who practically invented science, from, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, but every single one of them wasn't just a Christian, but was a serious Christian. So we have bought so many lies, even in the church, that we really, really need to do a deep cleanse and get with the actual facts. And that's why I wrote the book. I said, we have been living in a world where even the church has bought a lot of these lies and sort of half apologized and stuff. And I thought, this is crazy. This is really crazy. What they are saying is so convoluted and confused and factually nonsense. We need to at least know that if we're going to have an honest conversation. And I also say that I don't think there's such thing as an atheist. I think at this point, knowing what we know, you can be an agnostic. But to say you're an atheist once you know just what's in the book, and of course there's an infinity beyond it, but it becomes impossible to be a serious atheist.
I was going to ask, why do the atheists care? Why have they made it their own religion?
That proves the point. This is the funniest thing of all, that when an atheist gets all animated about trying to prove that there's no God and trying to convince you, he is himself proving that he doesn't believe what he says he's believing. Because if atheism were true, there's no God, there's no meaning, our lives are less than the significance of a gnat. There is no meaning, there is no truth, there is no order in the universe, there's no nothing. So the idea that anybody would care enough to convince another person of something is self-refuting. It's like a snake swallowing its own tail, which is the cover of the book, is the Ouroboros, this mystical symbol of a snake eating its own tail. It refutes itself. All of the rage of the new atheists, ironically, argues that they don't believe what they claim to believe. I mean, there's hilarity in it, but first you got to see it as fact.
Eric, just as an aside, I'm an information junkie, so you don't have to be trying to prepare for a debate with an atheist to enjoy the book. I mean, you've got just bunches of facts that are just interesting stuff, scientifically, archaeologically. And, but as you say, the whole idea, and we've got like a minute here, but, the whole worldview implication of atheism and its impact, politically, sociologically, is critical in terms of its impact on the world and peoples and populations and so forth. We've seen the implications of what atheism does when it's adopted by a country or a political system. Can you comment some on that and what the world has seen?
But quickly.
Well, there's so much to say. First of all, the two biggest atheists of the 20th century, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, both became believers in God at the end of their lives. Nobody knows that. That tells you about everything you need to know. Secondly, every atheistic state in the world is sadistic and cruel on a level unimaginable to most human beings. That's for starters. I know at a time, every single thing in the universe, by the way, seems to point to God. The more science discovers about why is the planet Jupiter there? Well, it just so happens if it weren't there, there'd be no life on Earth. Everywhere you look, there's evidence for God. We've been living in a world that pretends that's not true. It's time we stop living in that world and just recognize the reality of things. God is alive.
Eric, thank you for taking your time to be with us once again. You've given a gift to God's people, and it's a wonderful one. The name of the book is Atheism Dead? And to go to the bottom line, it is a cold corpse. We got to go. Eric, thanks again for being with us.
Love you guys. Anytime. Thank you.
Great hour. And Eric and we felt the same. We had just started when it was time to bring it to an end. And Matthew, I do want to point out that you talk too much. You don't give anybody an opportunity to, hey, by the way, during the break, you were talking about a comedian, Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, there's a comedian I really like. Some of his stuff is just, it's not for everybody. But every single special he does, every single comedy special, no matter, he talks about his life, but he always finds a way somehow to talk about that there's no God and that Christians are stupid people, just totally ad hominem, no respect at all. And it's so often, it's so persistent and frequent. And you're like, I think he protests too much. I think you have doubts about your skepticism, and anybody who says they're an atheist, I know that there are events and everything that led to it. And this is not throwing rocks at those people either. I just think, as Eric has pointed out in the book, there's some holes in that belief system that might be worth taking a closer look at.
R.C. Sproul, incidentally, wrote a book called The Psychology of Atheism. He wrote it a number of years ago. And the thesis of that book was that if you're not one who believes in God, they called us abnormal. He said, there's something wrong with you. There's some traumatic incident that happened in your past. There are places that have brought you to this silly and superficial view. And he pursued it, and it was really good. That's a good hour. And that's true about the comedian. I mean, if I didn't believe in Santa Claus, I'm not going to write a book. about it. That would be dumb. I'm going to go smoke my pipe and read a novel, a mystery, do something productive. People do protest too much. Kathy, who's going to be on next time?
Well, this will be interesting. Next time we have Kyle Mann, who is Kyle's been with us before, who's with the Babylon Bee.
Oh yeah.
And the Babylon Bee and Kyle have a new book out, and it's titled The Babylon Bee Guide to Wokeness.
Hey, that's going to be great. And if you don't go to that website, the Babylon Bee, just to laugh and have fun, you're crazy. It's a wonderful website. And we'll find out more. We got to go. But we're going to come back. Same time, same place. Hope you'll join us. And between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you, of course, a wide, wide berth.
Jinx.
I do it every once in a while.
Wide.
Yeah, you gotta bring that back
Everybody
around.
should do that. Wide berth.